Hello.
Hi. I had the impression that on the album you relied a lot on improvisation.
Yes, very much so, in the music, yeah.
And how much is this important when you go on stage? How much is this element still?
Interesting point. I think probably within the context of several of the songs there's a certain amount of improvisation. But it's amazing how formulaic it's all become. It's down to, I think, it's a real challenge that, you know. You're quite right, that's a very interesting point. How far could one go on stage? I guess if I wanted to lose the audience entirely, which it seems I'm doing the best that I can at the moment, but the idea of making each and every show totally improvisational is... Exactly. I couldn't have put it better myself. It's terribly enticing, you know.
Okay. Hello, David. Firstly, I want to ask a question. Why does one make art? It's a huge question. It's a topic of discussion, perhaps, in many places. You know, a question that's been around for a long time, right? It's one of these things like, is there a God? Or, you know, what's the meaning of life? In a way, for artists, it's very similar to those questions, right? I want to think about the artist a bit in the way that Joseph Campbell talked about the hero and the hero's journey, you know? I think as artists, we are heroes in our own plays. We may be anti-heroes, like the underground man of Dostoevsky's novella or novelette, and we're like the characters in Kafka novels or stories. But we are heroes, like Bowie's heroes in quotation marks, you know, at least for one day, or at least in our own minds, or Warhol's 15 minutes of fame, right? For some period of time, perhaps. The thing is, let me go back to the question, and I'm going to tackle this from a number of angles, I think, or going to try. Why do we make art? Those of us who make art, those of us who are compelled to do it. And the thing about it is, and when I say art, I mean, you know, in my case, it may be music or video stuff, but in someone else's case, it may be literally visual art, painting, drawing, it could be writing. I also have written fiction and went to Brown for a Master of Fine Arts in fiction writing. So that's another form of art. Writing, painting, drawing, you know, acting in movies or plays, or writing movies or plays or anything. You know, even cooking can be an art in a sense, right? But why do we make art that is not something that can become, that is not something that is a commodity in and of itself, per se? So I mentioned a cook, and what's different about a cook is if someone makes some form of food, the idea is that they or someone else is going to eat that food, right? And that's something that you can sell, for example, or not necessarily though, right? If you're making for your family, but it's a kind of, could be commodified in that sense, right? We go to Starbucks we pay whatever we pay for our morning coffee, or we go to a restaurant or a bar to drink or eat, and we pay for that. That's a commodity in a sense, and we're willing to pay for that because, in exchange we get to eat this food or drink this drink that we want to eat or drink. But with art, it's something else, isn't it? Particularly if we're doing something that is not, and the line is blurry sometimes, but commercial art per se, right? We're not making something for a client. We're not making something to sell something else like a commercial for a product. We are not, I mean, if it's a soundtrack to a movie, it could be commodity to some extent, but it may not be, you know, again, depending on the kind of, let's say it's music. In my case, if you're watching this channel, you know the kind of music that I tend to lean toward making. My music often does have some form of melody or chorus, or it may have pop or rock or electronica like beats elements, dance elements. Could have any or all of these things that could be semi commercial or digestible to some degree, but actually the music I tend to focus on tends to not be so much in that direction. It may have elements of those things, but it tends to not be so much that, right? And I'm not thinking in that direction. If it has those elements, it's because they work in that piece, or because that's where the inspiration goes, right? But I'm not thinking in terms of who will want, you know, maybe someone wants to hear a techno song, so I'll make a techno song, or maybe someone wants to hear a catchy pop chorus, so I'll write one. That's not even a consideration in the music that I do, particularly now, but actually it never has been, actually. But and so by the same token, just using myself as an example for now, but I'll use other examples, and I want to kind of broaden this out, is, you know, why make something that is not necessarily going to get one any sort of thing in exchange in terms of either monetarily or popularity or some sort of, you know, like people are going to come and praise you because they love your song. And that's not to say that people might not praise you or make comments that they enjoyed what you do or did, or, you know, and you hear these things sometimes, but that's not the reason we make art, is it? It's not the reason I make art. And when I say art, again, in my case, I could say, or the reason I make music, or the reason I would edit together an hour-plus long documentary. I'm not doing it because that documentary is not going to a film festival. That documentary is not, you know, I'm not making any money from it. If it gets 10 or 15 or 30 or 60 hits or even 100 hits, it's just a drop in the pan, right? I mean, you can't monetize that, and I'm not trying to. And it's not the reason I do it. Which comes back to the original question, again, using myself as the example, firstly, and then moving out to a broader talk on this. Now, this again, it comes back, it's personal in a sense. I'm wearing a David Bowie shirt, an Aladdin Sane shirt where the stripe color wore off. It's I bought it in 2016, the year that David Bowie died, after he died, and I've had it ever since, and the stripe was gold, and the gold is gone, but I just wear it the way it is. It still has its luster for me. Behind me, I've got the photos of Sakamoto, David Bowie, and Ryuichi Sakamoto, David Bowie, and Jeff Buckley. Those are three influential figures in my world. And I want to talk about David's work, but I'm not going to talk generally about this or that or the other album per se. I've talked about Black Star, I've talked about other things. I'm going to talk about one of the most, and I've talked about this before a little bit, but I want to delve into one specific aspect of the album he did in 1995, which I constantly am saying publicly on my SNS feeds, whatever people I talk to, that it's highly, highly underrated to this day, I believe. Outside, or one outside, it was planned as a triptych trilogy with Brian Eno, kind of like they did the triptych in Berlin. Bowie was planning on 3 parts, and he, just to talk a little bit, give some background on his work and how it relates to making art, or why we make art, or I'll get into why I'm talking about this. So Bowie created, actually, a number of improvisatory suites, which are now referred to amongst those in the know, if you will, because they are not actually commercially available. They're not released officially on CD or on streaming services. The Leon suites. And Leon is a character that appears in the outside cycle, if you will, on the album. It has a kind of concept, and it has this kind of cast of characters. Bowie played the characters himself in terms of the voices on the album, and those appear as segs, they're interludes. But originally on the Leon suites, if one listens to them, you realize that it was just there were these long improvisations of about 20 to 25 minutes. I think the longest is maybe just under 25 minutes or something like that. Where Bowie and his members in the studio, I think it was Switzerland, including Brian Eno, who produced it. And Brian Eno actually used his flashcards, those cards, oblique strategies cards. So, he would flip one out of the pack and the drummer would play as if he were in the jungles of Africa or India or something, I don't know. And then he'd flip a card and the pianist, which was Mike Garson, would play as if someone was, chasing after him and he had to run away. I don't know, this kind of like abstract things. And that created these kinds of interesting situations for the musicians to improvise. And I think Bowie improvised many of the vocals on the suites. And The Heart's Filthy Lesson, for example, it said he improvised. Actually, that was recorded later. It gets complicated because what happened was Bowie and his band recorded the suites and he pitched them to his label at the time. And the label said, sorry, we can't release it this way. It's just not commercial enough, basically. No one will buy it. And so it was dropped, and he went back into the studio the following year in 1995 with, and the band members, and they kind of split it up into more song-like songs, which, if you listen to the Outside album, I'm Deranged, Heart's Filthy Lesson, I just mentioned, other things. And then the segs were the bits where the characters speak, and Bowie is using effectors on his voice to sound like female Ramona A. Stone, who's kind of ambiguously female but maybe a bit male, and also she's cyborgian. And Leon, who is was convicted or on trial for having murdered baby Grace Blue. That's another character, supposed to be a 14-year-old girl who was murdered in the name of art, that her parts were strung up to create art like in a museum, and so on. And there's this storyline, and Nathan Adler is the detective role that Bowie also plays. And he has a New Jersey accent, and he kind of hams it up. And those voices you hear on the Leon suites, and those so-called segs, those parts, Bowie is actually doing over the music as the band is sort of improvising. And some of the themes that they improvise became songs on the Outside album, Bonafide. Okay, so there's the background of that. One character who is central to the entire cycle, as it's called, or the storyline, which is very vague and open-ended, and this is one reason that critics and fans, if you will, alike, never sort of were able to grasp it, and people in reviews and even the fans on, chat things online at the time, and still to this day, at times if you read these things, you see, they complain about the segs. They say they're unnecessary. Who needs these voices? Who cares? Give us the music. We don't care. But the segs in the album's too long at 75 minutes for a single CD at the time. Or, who will listen to a full album at 75 minutes on Spotify? Most people won't have the patience for it. I do, if I enjoy the album, if I enjoy the work, and particularly if it's something that has a kind of, theme or storyline to it, I definitely want to listen to it as it was meant to be played and listened to. And I'm going to get back to this idea later. So Outside, with the segs. And the central character, getting back to this, that is not he, if you will, is assigned a role in the lyric sheet for Outside, which in Japan, for example, if you buy the CD in Japan, it also has Japanese translation of the lyrics and so on, and in Japanese and English, whatever language. Each song is assigned to a character. So like Leon blank, the accused, sings, "I have not been to Oxford town." He's saying, "I wasn't there, so I couldn't have committed the murder." He's sitting on, he's on trial, he's in prison, kind of thing, or maybe convicted. Ramona A. Stone sings, "I am with name," I was this kind of cyborgian thing, etc. And Baby Grace talks about what is going on and how she doesn't say, "I'm about to be murdered," but she says something horrid is going to happen, kind of thing. And from the storyline, we know that she's murdered. And there are 3 songs on the Outside album itself that are assigned to a character called Minotaur / artist. Minotaur or Minotaur, depending on the pronunciation of that, comes from Greek mythology, of course. Minotaur in his labyrinth, and he is a figure that is kind of lonesome. Well, again, in Bowie's work is equated to an artist, or the artist, with a capital A. Minotaur also capital M. And so would be in his labyrinth, kind of a lonesome figure, but also a beastly animal, depicted in some places as sort of having sort of orgies with many women, this kind of thing, like, this animalian creature, but at the same time there's a sense of this creature being isolated and a bit mad, maybe, and in the labyrinth, right? And Borges with his labyrinths, right, we get this kind of imagery of something like this. And Picasso also depicted the Minotaur, and apparently Bowie was somewhat obsessed with that, and Bowie was an art collector, and in 94, 95, around that time especially, we heard of his, he was doing art exhibits himself, displaying his paintings, getting more involved in the art world, and that sort of coincided with the Outside album in that period. Then he got more sort of taken off into the touring part, and in 97 they did the Earthling album, and he sort of shifted gears, and that's one of the reasons too that he sort of got sidetracked and went in another direction, became a little bit more popular, if you will. He started to kind of go in that direction, doing more touring, doing more pop-like songs, and the Outside trilogy that was to have been never was, and he was planning to complete it by the end of the millennium with Brian Eno. He was talking about doing it with Trent Reznor, because he was working with Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails around that time. They toured together in 95 for a brief spot in the US, and Reznor more famously perhaps remixed I'm Afraid of Americans for the Earthling album in 97. They both appear in the video. It's kind of comical. And after Bowie died, for example, Reznor covered he remixed and covered I Can't Give Everything Away, and he talks about how Bowie saved my life when I was addicted and this and that. So they were friends as well. They became friends. But so Bowie got sidetracked. The trilogy was not completed. Let's get back to Outside, the Minotaur, the artist. I started this talk by asking, why do we make art? Why does anyone make art? And what does it mean to be an artist? And I've talked about this on my page before, but this is, again, me sort of thinking about it again and coming at it from a slightly, I think, different angle this time. To be an artist is to have, to be obsessed to some degree in order to make one's art. And in order to make it although it may involve others, like in the case of Bowie and say Outside in those sessions, he was involving other band members, but they were sort of, I imagine there was an energy there that was pulling them together at that moment. For many artists, it's more lonesome than that. And of course, you know, if you're Bowie writing songs, one thing he talked about, this is not Outside period, but later when he was writing songs for Heathen, is that he isolated himself and he was up sort of in this cottage or something in the mountains, as I recall, if I'm recalling that correctly, and he saw something through the window that made him cry, and he was overwhelmed, and he wrote these lyrics to, it was either Sunday or Heathen the Rays. It may have been Heathen the Rays, but Sunday has that feel to it as well, the opener and the closer on that album, Heathen, which the opener and the closer have that kind of melancholic feel to them, and they were written sort of in isolation. I think some of the songs on that album that are more rock or not, and he did covers and stuff. But getting back to Outside, getting back to the artist figure, and the Minotaur for Bowie, I guess, was representative of this artist figure. Now, the Minotaur / artist, if one reads very carefully into the storyline, and there was actually, Bowie actually wrote a piece that is included in the CD booklet or the album booklet or whatever. You can find it online, the diary of Nathan Adler, which is, again, very open-ended, loose pieces. They're diary entries and there's no closure. He's trying to figure out who killed Baby Grace Blue. Was it Leanne Blank? Was it Ramona A. Stone? Did they have a cult thing going where they were, you know, killing people, or they murdered her in the name of art, right? And my interpretation has come to be, and actually I've since read other things online where others have said similar things, is that the Minotaur, I'm going to use that pronunciation, was the murderer. But that's, the thing is, the Minotaur is assigned, as I said earlier, a role in 3 songs. The songs on the album, Wishful Beginnings, I'm Deranged, and No Control. I'm Deranged, No Control are about losing control and being crazy and possessed and mad. Again, Minotaur artist. And Wishful Beginnings is, you know, who's we that had the wishful beginnings? I'm sorry, little girl. Maybe that was Baby Grace Blue, maybe. And he's apologizing to her perhaps for the misery that he's inflicted upon her. That's one way to interpret it. It may not even be that. It's kind of open-ended, but seems that maybe the Minotaur was the murderer. But now, who or what is the Minotaur? In Bowie's Outside, it seems representative. Could be representative of all the characters. Nathan Adler has maybe that flair, that bit of madness and the artist in him. He's, I think he's assigned to the role of, you know, through these architects' eyes, singing about or presenting from the perspective of, right, viewing the world through the eyes of an architect. Philip Johnson, I think, was in the lyrics. And Baby Grace, we don't know. She was murdered. She was young, but she's actually Baby Grace. We get more dialogue in the full version on the Leon. In the Leon sessions, that's true of Algeria Touch Shriek as well. Who's this old man who's very lonely and wants a companion and is sort of not able to catch on to follow in the steps of the young people who were using the internet, which was just kind of coming into widespread usage in the mid-90s. Now we're, right, the big thing is AI and so on, right? But right, so Bowie started BowieNet a couple of years later. Actually, he was the first to do that and the first to publish a single online with Telling Lies. That was a downloadable single with the first. I think it was like an MP3 or something, and it took like an hour to download the thing with your hook, internet plug-in connection. If you're born in the 70s or 80s, maybe you remember this. If you're born in the 90s or beyond, then you don't know what that was. A very slow internet connection, but I remember it well. So, the Minotaur artist, maybe he murdered Baby Grace Blue, but maybe it's a metaphorical form of murder. I don't know. I mean, it's, you know, vague open story, and it was in the name of art. This story confuses people because it's so open-ended, metaphorical perhaps, and critics kind of hated it, and fans kind of hated it. Overall, I mean, it's not one of Bowie's sort of, what's Bowie's masterpiece? What's your favorite album? It's Ziggy Stardust, or it's Diamond Dogs, or it's Station to Station, maybe. Those are even a little bit avant, maybe getting closer to Station to Station. And then the Berlin trilogy, some people might cite Black Star as his masterpiece. That's a complex album, and it's a bit avant-garde too, and it's a brilliant work, and it is a masterpiece, I think. But very few people kind of say, oh, Outside's my favorite, or I think Outside is one of his best works. And I hear occasionally, I see online, or people will say that on occasion, but like, it's pretty rare. I think it's a very difficult album for people, and the sessions, the Leon sessions, had he released those, I think maybe the label was right in terms of being wanting to sell him as a commercial artist to some degree, that it wouldn't have sold, and it would have maybe further tainted his image, which at that time he was trying to revive his career as a vibrant, relevant artist post-80s, because the 80s he kind of made some bad albums and bad choices. He did Tin Machine. People kind of didn't like that very much either. And he did that also for the reason that he was trying to, clear the palette and have a blank slate to some degree, where he could start over again as a sort of avant-garde or semi, dangerous artist, rather than a Phil Collins period stadium pop artist, which he, starting with Let's Dance, produced by Nile Rodgers, and then going through to Tonight, and that terrible Glass Spider tour. And when I say terrible, I mean that both David Bowie himself was not happy with it. Apparently he burned the spider after the tour and said, I'm not doing this anymore. So Outside was, sort of like an intentional move on his part, it seems, to go more into the direction of avant-garde art and to be closer to, say, the Berlin trilogy, Lowe, Heroes, that feeling. And he also worked with Brian Eno again. He pulled Mike Garson back in, Carlos Alomar, people like this that he had worked with in the 70s a lot. And Reeves Gabrels from Tin Machine, who also himself was encouraging Bowie to go more extreme and to go outside the mainstream a bit. So that's significant. The Minotaur artist being the one who perhaps, he's, like I say, not a character that is, he doesn't have a seg. He doesn't speak. There are 3 songs assigned to the Minotaur, but he doesn't speak in a seg. And I don't think Nathan Adler mentions him as a suspect, because the Minotaur is a Greek mythology figure, right? So it seems metaphorical, representative, and also it's Minotaur / artist. Let me go into a little bit. It's not just a talk on David Bowie or Outside, but I wanted to talk about that for a couple of reasons. One is that the anniversary, by the way, of that album is coming up September 25th. It'll be 28 years old. That album blew my world to pieces when I discovered it in 1995. It was my first year studying in Japan ever. I was 22 years old, and it just blew me away. And through it, I then sort of, not discovered, but became more interested in the music of Nine Inch Nails. I knew who they were. They were popular when I was in high school, the first album, Pretty Hate Machine. But I wasn't really into it so much at that time. I was listening to like Led Zeppelin and rock stuff, and then I got into King Crimson, particularly 80s Crimson, and kind of the weirder stuff, and I was sort of like becoming more interested in so-called avant-garde music, you could say, but like I hadn't quite gotten into, I guess you could say, full-on electronic music, or what I later would, discover to be industrial music, Skinny Puppy and Coil, which is, I don't think they're exactly industrial, but they came from the ashes of Throbbing Gristle, right? So Psychic TV and Current 93 and this kind of weird folk music, and then Nurse with Wound, which is like totally, off the wall avant-garde stuff, and then noise music in Japan, and etc. David Bowie's Outside was the start of that trajectory for me. In that sense, you could say that if it weren't for Outside, maybe there would have been some other route in for me, but the route in was Outside. I was already a Bowie fan. I loved Lowe and Heroes, the Berlin stuff, and Scary Monsters and all that, and through that, then 9 Inch Nails, and from 9 Inch Nails I discovered Coil, who had done remixes and all the other stuff. And now I make music that I guess you could say is closer to that side of things than, say, Let's Dance. It's not that. It never was, actually. I was never really a huge fan of that period. But, so, it's not a talk only on Bowie and on Outside and Minotaur artist or Minotaur artist, but that representation, significant, right? So I just said September 25th, the anniversary of that album, and I just mentioned why it was significant to me. I remember when it came out and I bought it. It was the first CD I bought in Japan when I was studying here in 1995 in Osaka, and I discovered this other music. So that's the first reason. The second reason I mentioned is because realizing that the anniversary is coming up, I wanted to make a tribute, and I'm planning to record more in that vein and do my tribute to not only Outside the album, but to the Leon suites. And last year, the end of last year, I did a seg called Minotaur / artist. So I stepped in and made that seg, which didn't exist on the Outside album, and sort of updated it with some contemporary things, references in there. And I was planning at that time in December or so of last year to continue it and do my sort of tribute album, but I ended up doing Kether to Malkuth with the anniversary of Station to Station coming up in January and Bowie's birthday coming up in January, and I got sidetracked, you could say, much like Bowie got sidetracked with Earthling and stuff and didn't make the Outside sequels maybe. And then I started doing my triptych before my 50th birthday and doing other things. And then I revived This Dark Shroud this year, which was the beats and the other stuff. And I've been doing, if you're watching my page, you see I've been doing live shows. I want to talk a little bit about this, but I want to relate it to why do we make art? And actually it connects in some ways to my next project, which will be Minotaur. I have the seg from last year that I published in January on his birthday. Only 2 tracks, single. The Minotaur seg was only like 5 minutes or so. And It's No Game 2023 version, which I did a video for. And have performed a couple times live, and also from that I created a track called Tsunami, which is an instrumental version, which I just made, retained the Japanese spoken word part. I changed all the lyrics. And anyway, that second track, Tsunami, is on a recent release. I might mention that later, but Minotaur artist exists. I have the Logic file, and I'm either going to extend it or I'm going to put it on the Minotaur piece that I plan to do. Now, I'm not sure I'm going to make this September 25th deadline. That was my original plan, because it's like less than a week away. And I've been quite busy with many things, including This Dark Shroud, which I'm going to talk about and somehow tie it into this why do we make art thing, in my case, and hopefully make it broad enough that others can relate to what I'm saying. If you make art, if you make music, if you do stuff, if you're interested in Bowie, if you're interested in This Dark Shroud, maybe there's someone out there who is. I don't know, but This Dark Shroud, let me just say a couple words about that, because, again, Outside, why did I mention, recap, September 25th anniversary. Second, I'm planning on doing the Minotaur project. Third, this is, by the way, kind of thing, that I just completed a third and final for this year, This Dark Shroud LP, called The Signs Were There, and I actually posted it to YouTube as an audio file, and oddly, or I found it odd that it got so few views, because recent videos for This Dark Shroud have gotten, on average, 50, 60 views within, say, a week or less. And 24, 48 hours, it had like only a few hits, and just it was like no one, according to the stats, was watching it for more than a very extremely short time, like less than a minute. So I thought, oh, okay, so I took it down. It's actually uploaded, but it's not public now. And I thought maybe the timing wasn't right. And this actually, I mentioned this for a reason that connects strongly to this talk, because it was the reason in some ways I started thinking about this again so strongly. It's always a topic of concern for me, but why do we make art if it's not to gain in the case of music, listeners, or in the case of movies, viewers, or in the case of whatever it is, painting, people to look at it or buy it or whatever. It's not being done for the sake of either commodity or, people are going to praise you or come to your shows and make you feel, get that dopamine rush when, right, you get the likes in your inbox kind of thing or on your page. But it was, I thought maybe it's an algorithm thing, maybe it's bad timing, maybe, I don't know why. I just don't know. Because, it's fine for someone to listen to something and not like it, but if no one's listening or clicking, it might be another reason. So, but then that kind of wasn't the point ultimately. The point was then I started to think, well, I created this piece, which I feel actually is quite, an interesting work, and actually it's something that, although I produced it quickly, you could say it had been in the making for a long time, because I was working on an album called Vanity's Mirror as a solo piece, and actually completed it, or I felt it was complete, and then I started working on the This Dark Shroud. The signs were there, and then pieces of Vanity's Mirror I ended up actually using, and some I ended up remixing, rearranging, and using in different ways, and I ended up breaking up Vanity's Mirror, and then that became sort of another album too. And then I ended up with the two pieces that are related, but the This Dark Shroud is actually quite different, and the arrangements changed and things. And I did a few longer improvs on it, and one of them is called Oh Ramona, Where Has the Future Gone? And Ramona is a character, Ramona A. Stone, that is found in the Outside sequence, both in Leon and on the Outside album. And Oh Ramona, if there was only some kind of future, is a line from the Heart's Filthy Lesson that was apparently also improvised, or Bowie used these Burroughs, Geisen cut-up things he said to make those lyrics. So it was somewhat improvisatory or random. Oh Ramona, and on the Leon suite, in the Leon suite, actually, there is a part where he's improvising. He says, "Oh Ramona, can you hear me?" And that's also in Heart's Filthy Lesson. So mine, it was improvised, and that just popped into my head. Oh Ramona, what's happened to us, and I used kind of lines that were similar but not the same. They were sort of improvised coming out of my mouth, and I mentioned Patty, another character that is mentioned in Heart's Filthy Lesson, and I mentioned Minotaur, and that just came out of my mouth. And it was after that I looked up that Outside, I was like, Outside was released in the fall, and I looked it up, it was September 25th. So then I started thinking maybe I'll work on Minotaur again. But that piece, which is I think track 4 or 5 on the album, something like that, Oh Ramona, Where Has the Future Gone, does have references to Outside, and actually in a way it sounds a bit like Leon Sweets-ish. It's got piano trills and things, and improvised, and it's kind of a dark ambient under part, which is definitely my style and the thing that I've been doing, you could say, frequently, or that I use those kinds of things. But the feel of that, but the piano and the way the vocals turned out, although it's not all Outside reference, it's refers to all the other things that happened lyrically there that were improvised, but that became the title of the piece as well. And so I've been thinking about Outside, and I've been thinking about artist Minotaur, or Minotaur artist, or what is it to make art? Why do we do it? If, so I put this thing up and I got almost no hits and almost no listens, and it was basically ignored. And I thought, well, okay, but did I make it to get hits and people commenting or this or no? So, the bigger issue is then, why do we make these things? In particular, if there's something that don't have, again, going back to the beginning of the talk, it can't be commodified. I mean, the intention is not to make money. The intention is not to increase hits or fans, or it's the intention is it's an end in itself. It's a means to an end in itself, which is the process and which is the end product, which is the music, which I will listen to and someone may listen to. And some of my friends or people who seem to enjoy what I do, I shared it with those people, and it's not public, but it's now got some hits, and some people have written to me about those pieces and asked me things and said things about those works. So I'm not making music in a vacuum, and none of us is making are making this art that we make in a vacuum, whether it's music or something else. But the Minotaur in his lair, he's dangerous, he's obsessed, he's animal sometimes, sexual, which that part, the sexual energy, I mean, you think about sexual energy in like yogic traditions, right? You take that energy and you move it up through the spine, right? Whether or not you want to take that literally or metaphorically or whatever, and it goes upwards, and then it comes out in the form of energy or in the form of art, in the case of the artist, right? That you're expressing that sexual energy maybe in the form of art, which isn't to say that you can't also express it sexually with a partner, but, and, but he's dangerous and he's obsessed and he's maybe a bit insane, but he's also an artist. He's creating this work. And how dangerous is it? Well, in the case of the Minotaur, he goes too far, you could say, maybe, at least in terms of societally accepted norms and moral norms, where he murders a 14-year-old girl, if he is the murderer, to create a work of art, or what he believes is art, which is to take her body parts and put them up and create this thing. And Bowie was also inspired apparently by people like Damien Hirst, who were, cutting pieces of like animals, cows, I think, and putting them in glass and displaying them in the museum, and people go to see this. And that's, mid-20th century, not mid-20th century, late 20th century, mid-90s, late 20th century art. And where is that leading? And Bowie was also, he talks about in the Nathan Adler diary that Nathan Adler's writing about, right, the pierced lips, pierced eyebrows and nipples and whatever, and tattoos, and this kind of new, Bowie was interested in African American culture, and Africa, of course, his wife Iman, coming from that part of the world, and tribal, right, like the ears that are stretched. And Bowie was looking at these things and thinking, is this the new version of this? What people used to do in tribes and things, and putting, right, the bone through the nose or something. And then take that some steps further, and then Damien Hirst, and there were other influences. I'm getting back to the outside story. There are lots of references to things there if you look into them. The visuals to him with the eyes wrapped in the fish and all that. They're all references to other artists' work, and minor artists and European artists and so on. Like you think of Joe the Lion from Heroes was like this too, right? Nail me to my car, I'll tell you who you are, right? These references to artists who did extreme things that Bowie was interested in outsider art. And outsider art, right? So the outsider artist is a prime example, is an obvious example of the insane artist, or the outside, right? Outside, the album is called Outside, right? Leon takes us outside. It's the first track of Outside. We go outside the norm, outside society, and the artist is one who is outside. And so if you are on the outside, you are isolating yourself from others in order to make your art, or you become isolated because your way of thinking is different and you have no choice but to make that art, and so you're doing that in isolation, and you're doing that as apart from others' society. You may be dwelling amongst others in society, but you feel outside, or you're somehow, right, on the outside of those things, and one needs to be to do art. Well, he did Let's Dance in the 80s, and he did Right Tonight and Glass Spider and all that, and he had lots and lots and lots and lots of people at his shows, fans and stadiums, filling stadiums, and he hated it because he felt those aren't my fans, those aren't the people, this isn't why I started doing music. And Bowie, of course, was a major artist, so I mean, but what about the artists like perhaps you viewing and myself, who are not major artists, who are not making money, who are not selling out, not only not selling out stadiums like Bowie did in the 80s, but even like outside tour, where he had fewer fans, or Tin Machine, where he had even fewer fans, or the early days before he was famous as Davy Jones. Those of us who maybe, 2 or 3 people were lucky if they come to our show, right, on occasion, or buy our music, or listen to our music, or give us comments, or whatever it is. But yet, if we are still continuing to make this art, we are compelled to do it for some reason. So that's the question that I'm asking, is why do it? And actually, it's just why do it? On a relative scale, Bowie's Outside is not one of his most loved pieces. It's not one of his most highly lauded pieces. I would say it's one of his masterpieces, and that the Leon Suites in particular is just really mind-blowingly good and interesting. And I wish that Bowie had done more of it. And actually, he himself, according to Tony Visconti, and I'm not sure, but I think Eno himself said this too, wanted to get back to work with Eno, and I think he was planning to work with Visconti the next time and do outside-related stuff at the end of his life. And then he wanted to do a sequel to Black Star, but he also wanted to go back to the Outside story and to continue it. He never finished the trilogy in the 90s, and I think he kind of regretted that, and he said that Outside was sort of something really he felt was really strong and really good, but it sort of got, lost in the shuffle, and he wanted to go back to it, which, in a way makes me feel that, of course, he's gone, and of course no one can replace that, and that'll never happen. I've done, like I say, the Minotaur thing, and I've done many Bowie tributes, including the Black Star thing. Those are all kind of, they were my homages to him and that, but I really, because I do a lot of improvisation, and I've been listening to Outside in the session, the Outside album since 1995, when it first came out, and it's been with me all these years, and it's a huge, if I had to cite the most influential album on my music, it probably would be that. And then of course there's a whole string of other things that follow it. It's electronica, it's rock and pop, it's dance music, jungle, which at the time, right, which is stronger on Earthling, but it's got elements of trip hop. He liked Tricky at the time, Tricky Portishead, Massive Attack, right? It's avant-garde. It's the Motel is like a heartbreaking sort of dark, almost ballad in minor keys and with jazz piano flourishes, thanks to Marc Garson. And it's industrial music, Hello Space Boy, the original version, not the Pet Shop Boys version, which is more techno. It's all these things, and it's amazing. And it's, you could say that not every track is his strongest track, this, that, the other, but I think as an overall project, it's really, really, really underrated. And I think Bowie realized it too, and the sessions are incredible. And I wish the powers that be, who have the tapes and the wherewithal and the rights to release it, should do it by now and get it remastered and do something with it. And even there are sessions that are not available at all. Apparently there was a lot of stuff recorded that was in the vaults that hasn't been released. Anyway, Bowie had said that he had hoped to do it again, and that will never happen now. And it doesn't seem that any of his band members were excited enough to go back to the tapes and do something with them, or maybe it's a copyright thing. because they don't, they can't touch them. Like I say, they could certainly get back in the studio and do something, but it seems that no one really cares much about the outside thing other than David, who did care about it, and I care about it. So I'm gonna do a tribute called Minotaur, in the style, in a sense, but of course my own style as well, of the young sessions. And I may try doing, I've done actually covers of, I did I'm Deranged and I did Heart's Filthy Lesson years ago, and I put them on a compilation of Bowie tracks that I released, but I'm not super happy with those now. I mean, I would do it in a different style. My own music has evolved and changed, and I think the Minotaur / artist from last year that I released in January is much closer to what I want to do. And the recent track on the new This Dark Shroud, Oh Ramona, Where's the Future Gone, which isn't only outside, but like that kind of sound and feel. I think it will be more like this. And actually that kind of is like a companion piece in a way. I feel that already. Let me say a couple things about the This Dark Shroud that nobody listened to. It's 13 tracks. It's very cinematic in scope and has a kind of, it doesn't have a storyline and characters like outside or anything like this, but it's apart from the outside references, but it does have some improv things, and it does have some songs. I revisited some songs that, again, in some cases they were recorded for Vanity's Mirror, which became another album called Red Signals, which I'm releasing under the name Marc Lowe. It's on Bandcamp now. Replaced Vanity's Mirror, but the This Dark Shroud, the signs were there, has these longer improvs on them. One is a very long 18-minute improv that is mainly just very minimal, kind of, I guess you could call it ambient, dark ambient, something like that, with spoken word. It's just an improv. Then there's the piece with the Ramona thing, and a new track with some sort of half-spoken, half-sung bits that's very much, I think it sounds a bit 9 Inch Nails, 90s 9 Inch Nails. It wasn't intentional, it's just that kind of sort of quasi-industrial, but no screaming kind of piece. And then I tackled, Red Signals, which different versions, and some other things like Contaminated, which I did last year, and there's a new version called Recontaminated. Vanity, there are two versions. They were Vanity's Mirror, two versions from This Dark Shroud, the first album from this year, and so it kind of closes the circle in a way too, and some kind of Segue-like things, spoken word pieces. And again, why did I make it? Why does anyone make art if you're not doing it to have a product for sale, or you don't expect lots of people are going to listen to it because it's, accessible enough? And my favorite works tend to be things that are not the most popular. Scott Walker's Tilt, right? Bowie was a huge Scott Walker fan too. Other things like this, there's just so many. Sakamoto's stuff, he's back there too. And Coil, and these are other artists. Actually, This Dark Shroud started as a tribute to sort of 90s, 80s and 90s industrial music, but it sort of morphed into something else. Anyway, why make art? Because you don't have a choice. Because you enjoy it. Because it's asking you to do it. And you basically you do it. You're the slave to the muse, right? And that's, I think, a plus relationship, but there is that risk of madness. You may become the Minotaur. You may become isolated in your lair, your labyrinth, with or without the the pleasure animalistic seeking part, with or without. Music is my mistress, right? So that's my talk for tonight, I guess, on why make art, and on Bowie's Outside in particular, and on the figure of the Minotaur. And I will be doing this tribute, I think. I'm not sure I can release it by September 25th, maybe on YouTube if it's finished. Or if I have something even I can share, one track or a piece or something, I might do that on September 25th. And the new This Dark Shroud and Red Signals. And also there's kind of remastered live stuff from the three TBS shows. Two TBS shows. Fukuoka and Tokyo recently that I'll be releasing. Whether or not people listen, or buy, or stream, or don't. Alright. That's it for tonight. It's getting late, and I'm gonna bid the farewell for now. Peace, and keep making stuff. Just do it. Till the next time. Hopefully there'll be something from Minotaur up soon. We'll see. Get a chance to work on it. Till the next time. Bye. Good night. Marc, Lowe in Tokyo.
Minotaur. Or rather, I am the one who has been seeking for body parts in Oxford Town, New Jersey, all these years. My art is indisputably mine. And if you're looking for simple answers here, you shall be bitterly disappointed. Enter my lair with caution. For we are now living in the darkest of times. Her name was Ramona. I met her at some freak show, some carnival. Downtown Shibuya, I think it was. She was convinced that World War III was upon us. I Elias Mouse and all of his devious doings. They would be required for all of us. Brain patches. But I'm getting ahead of myself.